now, so we're be uploading as well. So happy Wednesday. Welcome to today's structured conversation on building a foundation for strategic assessment. My name is Renée Delgado-Riley. I'm the Director of Student Life Assessment and Research at the University of Oregon, and I'll be serving as your moderator today. On behalf of the SOL Professional Development Committee, thank you for participating in today's conversation, and an extra thank you to today's presenter. As you all know, and what we've shared on our website, we're very committed to involve and feature diverse perspectives and experiences in our professional development offerings. And ultimately, we want to meet your professional development needs. So if you want to share your perspectives, have ideas for future topics, please fill out the structured conversation form on our website or reach out to me directly. I'd always be happy to listen to requests, and we're always trying to be inclusive. So on to today's conversation. How do we make our assessment more intentional, meaningful, and impactful? Well, with any good house, it starts with the foundation. And in terms of structure and intention of our assessment practice can increase the value of both our assessment results for us as professionals and those that we might be reporting to and working with. So today's structured conversation will discuss both theoretical and practical approaches to structuring your assessment practice, including topics such as process mapping, models for evaluation, and a fresh perspective on student learning outcomes. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Ross Markle. He's the founder and managing director of DIA Higher Ed Collaborators. It's a company that works to help colleges, universities, and other organizations transition data into information and into action, the most important part of utilizing assessment results. So his research has focused on the co-curricular and curricular aspects of non-cognitive skills in higher ed, exploring how these factors are defined and used as measures of what students should learn, as well as how they predict important enrollment outcomes such as retention and persistence. So in practice, Ross is focused on the application, improving the application, integration, and use of non-cognitive assessments, emphasizing that quality measurement is simply a prerequisite. Ross is an amazing human being. I've known Ross for 11 years. He served as a mentor to me very back in the day as when I was a first generation research scholar, and he's really kind of helped pave the way for me professionally and academically, just inculcating on me important values of assessment and strategic assessment foundation. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand over the mic to Ross. But before I do that, I do want to encourage you all, if you have questions, please post those in the chat. I'll be monitoring. Please make sure you're engaging if you have any questions at any time. This is going to be interactive to the best way we can on a virtual webinar. And so I'll give it to you, Ross.
Thank you, Renee. And I do feel obliged to say the part about me being a wonderful human, I did not write in the bio. That was Renee adding on there. So I'm very excited to talk with you all today. And some of this stuff, depending on where you are in your assessment expertise, might be very new, might be a little bit familiar. But when I talk about some of these things as foundational, I don't mean that they're beginning skills. I do mean that they really help establish a foundation for our assessment plans. And that I think that having some input from, I even hesitate to say theoretical models, air quote, because I feel like that sounds very academic. But I think a lot of some of the best practices in the last couple of years around assessment are really helpful for us to build a more thoughtful and meaningful plan for assessment beyond just the sort of cycle of assessment that many of us know and love and practice. Practically speaking, I just want to say Renee's going to help out, as she mentioned, with moderating. So if there are things that I bring up throughout the conversation, please don't hesitate to drop those in the chat box, and I'm happy to kind of answer things on the fly as we go along. So of course, our learning outcomes for today, I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of assessment context and kind of give some ideas about accountability versus improvement-based assessment. As Renee mentioned, I want to give a little bit of a fresh perspective on student learning outcomes, and then talk about some ways that we organize our data. So one of the things that I find kind of funny about working in the assessment community is how many of us enter this job to which there's so much inherent resistance. Those of you that have tried to work with others in assessment know that there are these things people generally say about, oh, well, our work can't be articulated, or, why are we doing this? And all those things that we generally hear from a lot of folks that might be resistant to assessment. And I think the "you don't fatten pigs by weighing them" quote is one of my favorites that'll sneak back around a little bit later on. But one of my favorite quotes that relates to our assessment work comes from Galileo, where he said, "Measure what is measurable and make measurable what is not so." And I think Galileo is like a really excellent example for our work in student affairs, because we run into a lot of constructs and concepts, whether that's personal development or civic responsibility, cultural sensitivity, all these sorts of things that we work with in the co-curricular, particularly on a learning outcome side, where people will say, well, we can't measure this, or this can't be fully understood, or how can we articulate this when we don't know all the varying backgrounds, experiences, or paths of our students? And I would say, think about Galileo. I mean, when Galileo was born in 1564, we had no scientific method. We had no means of even reliably measuring time or temperature. We still thought the Earth was the center of the universe. I mean, forget talking about how far away the moon or the sun were, measuring things like that. I mean, he even came up with the concept that light moved, let alone some initial ideas about how we might measure that. So when Galileo came along, people said about the world many of the things that people say about education today, that we'll never know that. I mean, they were ethereal, godly constructs in the eyes of many at this time. And so, if you can adopt a little bit of Galileo, I think that, I'm pretty sure we can figure out how our programs relate to outcomes like student learning and student retention, if he was able to figure out how we measure light in the 1500s. Now, I'm big on paradigms. I'm big on kind of fundamental ways of thinking and how we understand the connection to the way that we think and operate today. And I want to talk a little about the context of assessment and how this has changed, and more importantly, how we live with a lot of the sort of inheritance or symptoms of previous eras. So for many of us, whether we realize it or not, why we do assessment now is based on the Spellings report in 2006, where the Department of Education under Margaret Spellings at the time, really kind of coming off a lot of the No Child Left Behind kind of stuff, was saying, look, like, there's all this money that goes into higher education, the public value of higher education, and yet really we don't do a whole lot from an accountability perspective to see what's going on. And one of the things that was particularly called out by the Spellings Commission was a true lack of learning outcomes assessment. We didn't have any grasp really of what students learned in higher ed. We just assumed that they went in, that colleges and universities were really smart, and those were smart people, so they must be smarter when they get out of there. This is contrasted with where we all, or many of us, find ourselves now in sort of this improvement-based era of assessment, which is, I think, articulated really well in a NILOA position paper written by Keston Fulcher and some folks at James Madison University, my alma mater, called "Weigh Pig, Feed Pig, Weigh Pig," which is basically, kind of the mantra for this idea that, well, let's do assessment, let's go change some things, let's come back and see if that worked. In this idea of we're using assessment for our purposes to help us get better. My colleague Javaro Russell and I, when we were at ETS a couple years ago, wrote a report called Assessment for Improvement. I'll give you the citation, it's available, where we talk about this transition. But I think what's really important is to understand that we lived in this era of accountability for so long, and so many of our systems and processes, et cetera, were built in this era of accountability, where we looked at assessment in order to demonstrate effectiveness. Because it was accountability, we were going to our state, our accreditor, the federal government, whoever it was, to say, your money's safe with us, we know what we're doing, here's our evidence of improvement. And that's very different than where we live now, where oftentimes assessment is us gaining information for ourselves to guide improvement for us. And I think that's really important to understand, because it has a lot of sort of tensions and transitions. So we go from an era where assessment was externally driven to internally driven, even though kind of the way we live now with our accreditors, it's kind of that we are externally driven to be internal, if you will. One of the things that I think is really important is what Peter Ewell talks about in terms of assessment under accountability was about showing what we did well. We wanted to look good in accountability-based reports because that's how we justified our existence. Whereas when you're using assessment for improvement, you are looking for what you're doing poorly. You're trying to find areas to grow and get better. So it becomes really difficult, and you have to have a lot of confidence in what you're doing to say, I'm going to actively seek out what we could be doing better. I think the biggest thing that we don't often articulate as assessment professionals is that generally we think of assessment as we want good results because if we're doing well on our results, that means we're doing well. When if you talk to any accreditor, what improvement or what quality is in assessment is showing that you have gotten better. It's not that you were high last year, it's that you're higher last year than you were the year before. And this is what I think where we get a little stuck sometimes in assessment, because so many people want their results to be good. They want to show that we're having a positive impact. But what SACS really wants, I mean, this is what closing or HLC or middle states or whoever your accreditor is, right? That what they want to see is that you know how to use data, you know how to use information to get better. That's why we always talk about closing the loop as being sort of the holy grail in assessment, because that is improvement. That is taking information and using that to get better, which is far more important than showing that you're in the 90th percentile. If you're in the 90th percentile every year, then you're not really growing and changing. And assessment isn't doing its job under an improvement-based paradigm. And this is where we kind of come to the crux of why I think these foundational tools are important, because perhaps the main tension is shifting from measuring what they want to gathering what we want, to going out and saying, these are our learning outcomes, these are our measures, our definitions of success. And the kind of blessing and curse of that whole situation is when it was measuring what they want. I mean, whatever your construct that you're talking about, whatever accountability organization you're talking about, if they just gave you a test and said, this is where students need to do well, we would have lots of complaints about, sort of oversight and constriction and those sorts of things, but at least we would know where the bar was. The challenge now is that we have to articulate that in so many ways, shapes, and forms. And that requires a lot more, sort of tools, skill sets, and knowledge on our part about what we want to do. Assessment is now a process we own. And again, I think that's great for a lot of reasons, but it requires a lot of these foundational tools that I'm going to talk about today, I think, to think differently than just going about it the way we were sort of handed from that accountability-based era, which is we're going to measure students at time one, we're going to measure them at time two based on these constructs that we all thought were important. And that's, there's a lot of different ways to going about it that I think can be really helpful. So I want to talk about 3 foundational tools for measuring what you want. And these foundational tools, again, are not about foundational in terms of simplicity. They're foundational in terms of building a foundation for a strategic assessment plan that gets you a great deal of valuable information. So why not start where we always started in the conversation, which is student learning outcomes. And I've always, despite having done too many to count student learning outcomes workshops and talking about ABCD and hearing people get criticized for the language, and that's not an action verb, all that stuff that we've probably all gone through and maybe even told people at times about student learning outcomes. I want to give a little bit of a different perspective. And first say, well, why do we write student learning outcomes? Well, in an accountability-based era, it was kind of to say this is what we do, this is why we're important because we're impacting all these areas. But really, I think a good general way to think about it is we're trying to articulate our impact on students. And I think this is something where whenever people say, education can't be quantified, or, these sorts of very sort of old school academic arguments about, like, well, just you can't really quantify or even articulate the impact that education has on students. I think we should be able to do that at least a little bit, right? Like, we should at least be able to say what we're trying to do to contribute to student learning and development. And it can be difficult and it can be very, if you will, highfalutin at times. But I think we should, if we're going to be the experts and we're going to run organizations of higher education, we should be at least able to articulate in some way how we want to change students from the day they walk in our door to the day they walk out of it, even if that door is now metaphorical in a pandemic world. But the way we answer that question and seek to articulate that impact varies, again, based on this paradigm shift, because in an accountability era, we were trying to articulate the things that we thought students should learn regardless of institution. That's the idea, is that an accountability agency says every student needs to have a certain level of critical thinking or civic engagement or whatever the construct might be. And in that world, comparability is important. But in an improvement-based era, we are now trying to articulate the things that students learn within my program or at my institution. And now we're trying to distinguish very different purposes in writing our student learning outcomes. And in fact, I'd argue there are opportunities in many ways. So here's some ways where I think we go wrong and where we mess up and where we kind of lose the value of what writing student learning outcomes can be to contributing to a larger assessment world. The first is that we view SOLs as the creation of them or identification as a bureaucratic exercise. And gosh, it's really frustrating to me when folks view that time of writing student learning outcomes as something that they have to get done for an assessment process, which is something I would imagine many of you can empathize with. What I think is a real solution here is to remember that, as I said, this is an opportunity to articulate your impact on students. Why is the experience that students are going to have with you different than what they could get from a peer institution or a different program or whatever it might be? And this is when you can adopt this sort of mindset about student learning outcomes as this sort of mission statement, if you will, about your impact on students. I think it can become really valuable and a much more sort of, if I dare say, inspiring exercise. In fact, when I first started doing this work kind of fresh out of graduate school, I used to kind of get very excited about this and say, student learning outcomes are how we say we want to change the world, right? This is how we say we want students to be different, again, from the day they walk in to the day that they leave. But if you shift to thinking about this again from sort of a strategic, long-term, scientific, if you will, perspective on understanding students, SOLs are our hypotheses about our impact on students. We're saying that we think if we have this intervention, programmatically, academically, institutionally, whatever it might be, that this is the change we are going to see. And then we're going to use assessment to come back and test that. So, Galileo is actually kind of a nice parallel here, given his founding of the scientific method, because it's really saying SOLs are our first statement about what we think students should do differently as a result of our interactions with them. And I always say, remember, if you don't take time to deal with your SOLs and make something that's meaningful right now, then you're just going to have to deal with them when the time comes to write a report, because if they were bad when you wrote them, they're going to be bad when you have to go measure them and report them and so on and so forth. The second pitfall I see, and I talked about this a little bit the last time we had a conversation, I joined a SOL group in one of these structured conversations, is that I think we overemphasize our individuality. As much as I just said, hey, take this as an opportunity to articulate your impact, I think sometimes we fail to learn from what others are doing in a way that is meaningful and can give us sort of some shoulders to stand on as we look to not only develop programs, but assess them. I always make this joke that I think kind of the funniest paradox to me about higher education is that every institution is a snowflake. Every school is different. We can't be compared. We are different from that school. We're not the same. And I agree. If you take all of the resources, student characteristics, all of the factors that go into comprising an institution, they are all different. And yet, what is the number one thing that we say when we talk about, improving retention or building something at well, we're adopting best practice. We're doing what everyone else is doing. So you kind of have to settle that conundrum, if you will, of this sort of individuality versus best practice idea, and understand that there are things we can take and learn. It doesn't mean copy and paste or duplicate, but it means that when we build things based on best practice, or I would really emphasize research and assessment, then we're in a lot better position. And I think, as I'll talk about in a second, Student learning outcomes are really a centerpiece of that when we try to articulate the impact that we're having on students. Now, I think what's really challenging here is that, especially in the world of student affairs, I don't know how many of you are, PhDs in developmental psychology or student learning, or, some of these things that would really help us understand the way that students cognitively, emotionally, socially develop, right? So this is where you kind of have to find someone who is going to be that person to be thoughtful and maybe help, peruse research and all the, this is where sometimes I think we get in trouble because we assume we're the first to do it because it hasn't, we haven't run into it before. We may need to talk with our professionals and really get into a world where we're saying, like, okay, I see the way that you articulated this outcome. I think that's 80% of what I want, but how am I going to tweak that a little bit to be precisely what I'm talking about? I think there's really a fine balance between being restricted by existing methodology, a lot of the things that people don't like when they talk about quote unquote standardization, but losing the benefits of standing on an extant body of research or practice. So one of the things, and I'm coming back to student learning outcomes here, is that there are many ways to talk about sort of the ways that our co-curricular student affairs programs, resources, et cetera, have impacts on students. And, as Renee mentioned, a lot of my work is on how we understand the role of non-cognitive factors in impacting student success. And I was actually talking a couple years ago with Sarah Finney at James Madison University, who many of you might know. She's run student affairs assessment there for a long time. And I was talking about, using non-cognitive factors as the predictors of student success. And she said, well, they are, but in many ways, they're also the outcomes of the interventions we're trying to have with students. So for example, this is just the framework of factors that I use in my assessment work with institutions where, again, we're trying to predict student success, doing sort of formative intake assessments. But many of these factors might look familiar to you, but with a little bit of further definition and getting them into the right sort of format where we feel comfortable building something from a measurement perspective, these are the outcomes which we are seeking. So I'm not saying take this and this would be your model of outcomes for your division of student affairs, but it might be a good framework with which to start. And not that this is just self-flagellation by any means. There's other areas we can look, right? So the National Research Council built a framework of cognitive, interpersonal, and interpersonal skills. And I've got references at the end of the talk if you really want to go back and look at these reports. I was involved about a decade ago with an initiative to kind of synthesize frameworks of student learning outcomes across higher ed. Now, admittedly, this refers to both academic and co-curricular sorts of interventions, but the idea being that this paper was really meant to be a synthetic, kind of review of these student learning outcomes. And so what I would say is you want to take student learning outcomes as an opportunity to say, hey, this is the foundation. This is really important. This is where we're going to articulate our impact on students. But if you tie that into existing frameworks and other areas, then you have the advantage of having a more rich understanding of student learning and development, of possibly having access to assessment tools, of tips for intervention, so on and so forth. So in this way, I'd say, rethinking kind of the way we go about student learning outcomes from this sort of bureaucratic, creative process to more of, dare I say, kind of a research review, I think is really important. So I would say, you want to use SLOs as an opportunity to articulate your impact. And by, emphasizing to say your program, your institution, whatever that might be. But you also want to make sure that that articulation is informed by whatever extant research models, et cetera, might be available to you. The second thing I want to talk about is process mapping. And this might be another term for you that it sounds familiar. And it may take me a minute before you fully understand why I think this is critical to some of the stuff we're talking about with strategic assessment. But I think a lot of people, especially if you're at a director's level or above, have probably done some sort of organizational based process mapping where all the directors get in a room and they say, well, I run the student leadership program, or I run our civic engagement program, and here are all the things we do. And by the way, I don't even know what this is from. This was just the most complex picture of a process map I could find. But at the end of it, our college or university gets this picture of the way that all of our things interact. And then we can say, yep, this is the way the system is supposed to work if everybody does their job and students show up in the ways that we think that they will. I tend to handle process mapping a little bit differently. This is one of my favorite process maps of all time, because I sat down with a school that I was working with and asked them to sort of talk about what happens to a student from the day that they are enrolled to the day that they successfully come back, day one of the spring semester. And I said, okay, what are the things they need to do? Who do they need to interact with? And as they're shouting out programs or steps in the process, I'm doing this in PowerPoint. This is actually, I mean, literally the live capture of that conversation. And at the end of it, I said, okay, well, how does this help us understand the way that our programs and services interact to work with students? And most importantly, how do students know how this works? And I'll come back to that in just a second. But that is always the question that when I go through process mapping with schools and say, like, okay, we have all these programs, we have services, experiences we want students to go through, et cetera. How do students know about that? And I always often find that's the moment where people look at each other and think, oh my gosh, none of this makes sense. As I once was working with a group of community college presidents, and we were talking about sort of the opaqueness of higher education to students. And one of the presidents said, yeah, what the heck is a bursar anyhow? It's a term that doesn't get used anywhere else in our world. And yet for students, it's arguably one of the most important things they need to visit in their time at higher education. So I talk about process mapping as having one of two approaches, where in this organizational setting, we bring in directors, senior administrators, whoever it might be, and everybody presents what they're supposed to be doing. And this ultimately represents the system as it's designed to be. But I would argue this experiential sort of process mapping considers the student experience. We really try to think about, again, three questions. What does it look like from point A to B, whether that's the first semester, the first year, their whole time at your institution, whatever that might be? Who do they need to interact with in that time? And then how does the student know? And I think the real important thing here is that this represents the system as it is, rather than as it's designed to be. Because look, if the system worked perfectly as it's designed to, we'd never have a problem with retention or graduation. Students would, I mean, we might have, 2 or 3 percentage points for the unexpected things that we can't account for, but basically everybody would make it through. We got to think about this stuff a little bit differently. Now, how does this help us from an assessment perspective? I think it really, gives us insight into the student experience. Obviously, there's a lot of student success aspects to process mapping. But the thing I really want to come back to, and what I've kind of set this up for, it kind of can help us understand maybe the way things interact and how we might consider different student populations. Where does the process branch? It can answer a lot of, I think, strategic and setup things from an assessment perspective. But one of the things Renee and I talked about was this idea of co-curricular transcripts. And I've been kind of allude to this now, and I'll come back and hammer on this a little bit later on. But the idea is that if we have this idea of things that we want students to experience that aren't currently captured on their academic transcript, process mapping is a really good way to identify what those things are. So again, we're using process mapping as a means of articulating how your intervention should work and maybe getting some understanding on if it actually works that way. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about, and this is going to tie back into, if you liked the conversation of co-curricular transcripts, we're going to come to that in just a second. But I even cringed a little bit as I typed up this slide and understanding that when I say frameworks for your data, there's a lot of boringness that may emerge in your conceptualization of what this topic might be. But I promise that I think this is, the best way that we can view kind of anew our assessment efforts and use it as a way to make sure that we are being strategic in the things that we gather. So when I talk about frameworks for your data, it's again that idea that really simply, if we look at what research is out there and what work has already been done, we can learn a lot. And it doesn't mean that we have to take that as biblical in the way that we're going to go about our assessment approaches, but it can give us a lot of useful information. So we can identify the strengths and challenges of our existing data collection efforts. We can compare and contrast different forms of data using these frameworks. When we get good results in our assessment reports, if we use these frameworks, we can be more compelling in making the case for the effectiveness of our programs. And when our results suggest there's ways to get better, these frameworks can give us more meaningful information so that we don't skip steps. And I'll come back to that a little bit later on. So the first framework I want to talk about is implementation fidelity. And I don't know how many of you have had the chance to maybe get vaccinated or exercise since you know, we've started to live in this world. But I was struck today when I went to work out about you know, implementation fidelity is about how well our programs get implemented. And so, for example, we can have a program of going to the gym and look like this, or we can have a program of going to the gym and look like this. And what implementation fidelity says is we might label these the same intervention, but they are very different. And how do we begin to articulate that? So, oops. So implementation fidelity, which you might also hear talked about as treatment fidelity, it really says, you know, we build an intervention. We have this idea of how we're going to interact with students, whether that's a course or a program or, you know, a 1 hour speaker that comes to campus or does a Zoom, however we're dealing with it these days. It's really saying we designed an intervention. Was it implemented the way that we designed it to be? So rather than saying we have students who didn't participate, they get a 0, and students who did participate, they get a 1, we might also measure things like the frequency, the duration, the quality of that interaction, so that rather than 0 and 1, there's kind of a range, you know, that's got decimal points in it that gives us an idea of that intervention compared to the way that we wanted it to be. Now, why does this matter? Just like going to the gym, you know, we have a lot of things like high impact practices that we talk about as being very relevant to student success. And so, for example, learning communities. These are one of my favorite things when I talk with schools about using learning communities as a strategy for student development or student success, whatever it might be. And I find it a lot of schools, when we talk about a learning community, students live on the same floor. And we can call that a learning community for sure. But we can also have learning communities where they don't only share residents, but we have programming in place to build social cohesion among students, helps develop affinity to that community. Students might share the same academic schedule. Faculty might even coordinate across you know, that shared schedule to make sure that either common materials or, you know, linked learning lessons, things like that, where you can see that, again, this is like going to the gym. These are the same thing, but if we don't use something like fidelity to measure how well one of these things is being implemented, the effectiveness is going to vary in a massive way. There's a really great review by George Q and colleagues, I'll be a bit old at this point, but where they talk about many of the best practices in higher education. Things like learning communities, student success courses, advising, new student orientation. And they say, look, if you look at the research about the effectiveness of these things, there's not really a synthesis that says they work or they don't work. What's different is how well you do them. And this, I could make the same case for student success courses or any of these other things to say, just because we call it that intervention, that doesn't mean that it's going to work. We have to do the things that are about a quality program. And fidelity is really the way that we go about measuring that quality and making sure that students get the experience that we designed. Now, there's 2 levels of importance here. And again, this is where we're going to come back to the transcript to say that, okay, at a program level, implementation fidelity really helps us to articulate what the quality of an intervention might be, particularly for something like when we talk about these high impact practices. And really getting beyond that, it's the practice and that it's what we're doing within that label that makes it really important. But it's also helpful from an assessment perspective, because if we're measuring the quality of that intervention and we don't get good results, we have a way of coming back to look at that. Now, at the student level, I think this is where I go back to that 0 and 1 idea. And something like fidelity helps us get at, okay, are we actually able to make meaning of this participation and say more than just, okay, a student was involved, but really what did that mean? And I think this is something that would be worth capturing on something like a transcript. I'm going to come back to an example here in a second, but there's a great webinar that the aforementioned Sarah Finney did talking about some of the implementation fidelity work that they've done at James Madison. The link is here. You can just Google Sarah Finney fidelity, and I think it'll be the first or second hit. But that's freely available online with resources, and the slide decks in there as well. And Sarah's really amazing. I'd highly recommend reaching out to her if this is something in which you're interested. But if we think about capturing data in this sort of co-curricular transcript perspective, you know, we really, one of the things that I kind of have resistance about with this idea of the co-curricular transcript is that it gets us back to that really, I mean, even pre-accountability based method of assessment, which is just counting, which is just saying students showed up and did it, which I'm a little concerned about that. But if we talk about fidelity-based measures and saying that, you know, not only did a student do these things, but that we have some indication of what that interaction looked like, and we can put some sort of meat on that, if you will, then I think that the value and meaning of that co-curricular transcript increases. Now, I want to shift beyond sort of that sort of inputs and dare I say kind of counting based stuff, if you will, and talk about some of the outcomes based things. And there's a framework for sort of comparing, contrasting data on the evaluation assessment side of things that I've used for, gosh, probably 15, 20 years at this point. I'm such a huge fan of it. And it's a model written by Stuart Kirkpatrick. And I'll give you the references for this, but this is, in my mind, a really good model and a really good example of where we don't just want to adopt it and just say, okay, this is going to be our framework, but try to learn from it to sort of, you know, see where our work currently fits. So Kirkpatrick's model was actually written initially as a model of job training evaluation. And what he said was that anytime you implement a program, an intervention in job training, there's lots of different data that you can look at to see if that actually works. So if, for example, we bring someone in for a training, at the end of that, we can ask them what they think about it. You know, those participant, you know, self-reports about participation are what we generally think of as reactions. That's the level of data Kirkpatrick talks about. The next level of data is called learning, which is where you actually assess whether or not people attained the skill or knowledge or attitude you were trying to impact as a part of that training. This is where a lot of our assessment work exists in trying to directly measure some of those things students learn as a part of our student affairs interventions. Behavior is about how you take that learning and then use it. You know, in this job training example, you know, if I train you in the classroom, if you think of it that way, and then you go back out on the job, are you using the things that you hopefully learned as a part of that training? And then results are really, well, did your use of that knowledge or skill have the broader impact that we had hoped for? So, you know, if we're doing a safety training, for example, and if people go use that, we ultimately should have fewer on the job accidents. Now, why is this valuable? Well, again, it not only helps us sort of compare and contrast these different forms of data, but for many people, their method of evaluation, not just assessment, but particularly evaluation, is to say, let's just measure the on-the-job accidents. Well, if you don't have these other forms of data, if on-the-job accidents don't decrease, then you don't really know where you could assume that the training didn't work. Maybe it's that people didn't use the information when they went back on the job. It builds sort of this logic model for you to get different pieces of information to evaluate whether or not what you're doing is working. One of my favorite models here is one that we used to use at a university I used to work at when we had a alcohol treatment program for students who got in trouble for drinking while they were on campus. And we would, you know, pull them aside. And if you've ever worked in this space, one of sort of the nice things is that, you know, students are on probation, so you can kind of get a lot of information out them without dealing with a lot of assessment fatigue. But, you know, we would, you know, do things like, you know, obviously ask them, what did they think of the training? Do you think that this made you a better person or help you get better strategies in order to manage alcohol effectively? And it should be clear, that's kind of a fundamental assumption of this alcohol treatment program. It's not about abstinence or prevention. It's really about saying, you got in trouble for drinking because you were being irresponsible. If you are going to use alcohol, these are the things that you should be doing in order to do that. So, that's the first thing, is saying like, okay, did we help you do that? Do you think that you can manage this, when you go back into whatever real world setting that might be? On the learning side, we would ask them, which of the following strategies should you be using if you're going to use alcohol? And things like counting your drinks, planning a ride home, things like that are healthier ways to manage alcohol use. Because they were on probation, again, we had this nice sort of control of assessment. So we would say, survey them 60 days after they left the program, and we would say, okay, the last time you were drinking, how many of these things did you do? Now, obviously, it's not the same as actually counting the behaviors, but you're getting an idea of if they took that learning out into the real world. And then finally, we would look at the academic outcomes, because the idea is, if we taught them this, they could go back to being good students. So we would look at, did they, return their grades to a normal level? Did they stay in for retention? Things like that. We would get faculty reports on attendance and engagement in classes. Those are things where you might look at that as saying like, okay, we want to make sure that happens. But again, you want to have that other data to feed in here. I have found, and all the time I've been doing this work, I think this is one of the most foundational tools for student affairs assessment professionals, because I feel like a lot of our stuff exists at this reactions level. We have students come in, we give them a program, then we ask them if they liked it or not, or if they thought it was effective. And even Kirkpatrick and some of the meta-analysis of this model will say 95% of evaluation exists at this reactions level. We're trying to get more and more information about learning. I don't think and not that we always need the behavioral level stuff, but this might give you an additional insight into your impact on students. And then at the results level, it's really just, that's where I think when we have things like retention or GPA, those aren't the direct impacts of our programs, but those are things that if our programs go well, we should see some positive indication. And so I think that having a place to position those data, understand their strengths and challenges, this framework I think is really useful for that purpose. Okay, so how does this help us be strategic? I mean, kind of wrap this up, as if anybody wants to start getting questions ready. I think we have to be clear and knowledgeable about our impact. I feel like the last time I had this conversation, I ended up coming away kind of feeling like, sometimes, we want to feel like we're doing something novel and new, and we may be, but that doesn't mean we can't learn from the extant literature. And there's so much that goes into, so much that already exists in many of these things that we're trying to do. If you're familiar with sort of some of the conversations that have happened around grit, one of the criticisms of Angela Duckworth is, well, you're really just basing this on a lot of existing research about conscientiousness. And I feel like we kind of get disserviced by this idea of imagining grit as a brand new construct, because we're not getting to learn from all of the research that already existed about conscientiousness. So understanding all that exists doesn't mean that we have to copy and paste that, or that what we're doing isn't valuable or unique. In fact, we can gain a lot from that. I think how we have to understand how our impact is actually experienced by students. And I think process mapping and sort of the treatment fidelity stuff give us some tools to understand how that might go, and then actually assess if that might actually take place. And then finally, when it comes to data, again, I'm not saying you've got to go gather all the data in the world, or that you need to start from scratch tomorrow with Kirkpatrick as your framework for evaluation. What I'm saying is that I think it's important that we think about the strengths and challenges of different forms of data. They help us out a lot, whether our results are good or not so good, because they can either help to reinforce the narrative of our effectiveness, or they can help us pinpoint where some things may have gone wrong. So with that, I'll kind of wrap up here and see if anybody has any questions. When I put this out, just to reassure you, there are references for all the stuff that I cited if you want to go pull those original materials. But in a structured conversation, I wanted to try to leave as much time for questions as possible. So let's see how much we can get.
Awesome. Thank you, Ross. This is just so great to see this visualized, as well as walking us through kind of like these 3 key takeaway strategies. So one of the first questions that kind of arose was when you were discussing the tension between accountability and improvement, and trying to make that cultural shift in our institutions to focus more on the improvement. what are some strategies for dealing with that culture shift? Like, what are things that we can do to, because as humans, everyone gets resistant sometimes, and, change is always, ambiguity and unknownness. But what are some strategies you would recommend to kind of help us work through that cultural shift?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where sometimes the way that we structure our assessment resources can be a bit challenging. Um, you know, I've worked with places where um, I remember my very first day on the job when I was director of student affairs assessment. The VP was taking me around and introducing me to programs, and I remember it was the woman that ran our Greek life office, and she said, "Well, I'll get you whatever you need." And I said, "It's not what I need; it's what you need. Like assessment is for you." And so I think sometimes when and especially if you're running student affairs assessment, you can feel this. You might become the one and only person that can do this, but in doing so you're kind of taking it away and taking the ownership away from other folks. Now I know I'm kind of talking out of both sides, because this is a little bit counter to when I'm saying, well, let's use the experts, the people that know what they're doing. So it's a fine balance between those things. But I mean, in Renee, you are, for those who don't know, Renee is the master of campus-wide engagement and bringing people into processes. She with baking and making jam and all these things. But not that you need to get down that road. But I think the first thing is the more you can bring people in, and not just make them a part of the process, but give them the competency to be involved in the process in a meaningful way, helps them see that this is what the goal of this is that it's for you to use information. It's not just for me to write a report.
I think you summed that up perfectly. I appreciate that perspective. Just moving on to some of the other questions that have kind of come up through this conversation today. In this improvement era, are internal benchmarks more important than external benchmarks? We'd like to hear your perspective on that.
100%. I mean, it depends on what your quote external benchmarks are and who they. I mean, if you're dealing with some situation and nothing really comes to mind where you've got an accreditor or a state agency or something like that saying you need to achieve something, that's a little different. But if you're talking about sort of national standards for things, I go back to the point of, I think in a lot of cases those can be informative and a good place to start, but you may want to also look at what is your local practice. I'll give you an example. I was working with a community college where we were talking about sort of some course placement standards and how we could more holistically place students. And we had found some research that suggested, a high school GPA of 2.4 was really the mark at which, students were much more likely to do well in college level courses, and that might be a good place to make that decision. And I said, okay, that's helpful, but let's look at our own data. Let's see if historically that's been meaningful. We might need to move that. If we use that as a benchmark, what are the impacts? So I would say internal benchmarks are far more important, but that doesn't mean that the external resources can't be valuable in how you determine those.
Oh, that's also very helpful as well. And then another question arose around, well, what's the difference between process mapping and logic models?
Great question. So I think it kind of goes back to that fidelity idea, in that a logic model is how you want things to work. And more importantly, a logic model oftentimes is encapsulating some of the latent phenomena that you want to happen. So when I think of a logic model, it's really about why are you implementing something? Because you want it to develop a particular mindset, characteristic, knowledge, skill, et cetera, in students. And again, I'm sorry to mention Sarah Finney's for like the 8th time, but she's also doing a lot of work on reasoned action and logic models as a part of assessment. I think that's a really good way to think about it. But then process mapping, is particularly the way that I'm talking about it, is how it actually happens. So you might say, we want students to engage in this, and then subsequently we see them go into this experience. And then if you say, well, does that actually happen? Or, are we not communicating that to students? That's, I think, the major difference is the sort of planned intervention and then the experienced intervention.
Great, thank you. So those were some of the major questions that arose. Are there any other questions from the group? Feel free to write these in the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself. We're a small enough community here today that you can unmute yourself and address the question.
So while we're waiting, I'm just going to go back because I don't know if it was Will or Renee in her response that talked about sort of the contrast between that pressure of where your leadership might push an external benchmark. Again, I think that's why when you can connect to this other research and try to expand what you're doing into extant theory, you're making yourself the expert, right? And I have some friends who work in the medical licensure community. A friend of mine runs, he heads psychometrics for the American Board of Surgery. And he said, it's really frustrating because you deal with these surgeons who, I mean, save lives on a daily basis and think they know what they're doing. He said, it takes a lot, but he said, at some point in the meeting, they understand that I know as much about this stuff as they know about surgery. And so when you have these tools to say, hey, I'm not just saying we need to change the benchmark, but it's based on these things we've looked at and these theoretical models, it gives you an extra pillar to stand on and support some of those conversations.
Any questions, comments? Thank you. We're getting a lot of thank you. And just FYI, the recording will be posted to our YouTube page. The slide deck will be emailed to everyone and be uploaded to the Sol repository Dropbox account. So everything will be transparent. You can share with colleagues. And I'm going to give Ross a few more minutes if anyone has any questions. Again, he's an awesome human, and anytime I need a sounding board, he's always there to kind of give me a different perspective or just kind of help be more articulate with what I was thinking. Any final thoughts?
No, this is great. I love the Sol group, and thank you, Renee, for having me and for continuing to put together such a strong program for professional development. So if there's any of this, I know I kind of went super high level on some of this stuff. So if you have more specific questions, or if Renee would have me, if you want me to come back and dive more deeply into some of these things, I'd highly recommend it. But I would also, again, Sarah Finney, who she's done a lot more kind of on the ground, in-depth work in some of these areas is, and someone you all probably know pretty well, is a really great resource in some of these things.